Arlington National Cemetery, my forever home. Jim Schoettler and I had been married for 56 years. Oh, this is a new way of starting this show, and it may be a disaster. So just hang in there. I'll get over it. And he died in March of 2012. And he is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Well, you can imagine that after 50-some years, that since Jim died, a lot of things in my life have been totally uncertain, except for one thing. One thing has been totally certain in my life. I know that I have a forever home. I have a forever home in an exclusive gated community in Virginia, managed by the Department of the United States Army, Arlington National Cemetery. I will be buried there with my husband when that time comes. Now, there are 300,000 or more graves in Arlington, and each one has a story. And I'm telling you our story tonight, and a little bit more than that. In 1964, my husband was in the United States Air Force. He was a doctor and a flight surgeon. He was transferred to Andrews Air Force Base and assigned to Malcolm Grove Hospital. He had chosen the Air Force and to be a flight surgeon because he loved flying and he loved to be around airplanes, and if he couldn't fly, he wanted to be close to pilots. We were very young. I don't think that we thought of ourselves as young, as you don't. You know, you're so full of attitude and knowledge when you're 28, 33. We knew so much, we thought. Well, we had just arrived in town. It was a couple of months later. I was in the kitchen one afternoon in our house out in Oxon Hill, Maryland, and suddenly we had 4 children. We had 4 children. I should tell you that before we get started. We had 4 children, a son and 3 daughters, 7, 5, 4, and 3. And our youngest daughter became suddenly quite sick. And I called Jim at the hospital and told him what was happening. And he said, put them all in the car and come out here right away. I'll meet you at the door of the emergency room. And when I got there, he was standing at the door waiting. A little snow had started to fall. It was December. And he held out his arms, and I handed him Gretchen, our youngest daughter. And he took her in and he took her back while I settled the other kids. And it didn't take long till he came out and said, it's pneumonia and we're going to take her upstairs. They're going to admit her, Elouise. I asked one of the nurses if they would look after the other 3 till we got settled, and I went upstairs. They started the antibiotics, and shortly into it, I informed everybody that I was going to stay with her. I was the mother. And they turned around and informed me that, no, you're not. And I said, I am. I'm the mother. And they said, that's the rule. You cannot stay. Well, you don't combat with the military. I don't know if you know that or not. But so Jim and I trusted that we were told that she would be fine. They felt good about it. She would be fine, and we could come back first thing tomorrow morning. And we had the other 3 kids downstairs, and it was snowing. So we went and we did what we were told, and we took them home. My first job when I got home, because I didn't have a mother's network, and if you're a mother, you know how important that is. If you're a father, you know how important that is. And so I had to get on the phone and fish around for people to come and to keep the other 3 kids early the next morning so that I could get back to the hospital. I was thinking 6, 7 latest. And finally I accomplished that. I found 2 women that would start off and one would come in about 1. And I was so proud. I mean, I was beginning to feel really relaxed and relieved that I'd handled this when the telephone rang. It was about 9:30, 9:45, and I answered the phone. "I need to speak to Dr. Schoettler, please." The voice was so rough, and I could feel the tension all the way through. And I began to realize as I reached out and handed the phone to Jim that I had just answered an unthinkable phone call. He took the phone and listened. I don't remember him saying too much, and he listened, and he reached out and leaned against the wall. The color drained out of his face, and he said, "All right." And he hung up. He had very long arms. I'd always loved that about him. He had very long arms, and he reached out and gathered me in. "Ellouise, Gretchen has died." I said, "Well, that can't have happened. They said that I could come back in the morning, that she was going to be fine. That cannot have happened." And he held me closer and said, "It has happened." And both of us were weeping. Tears were running straight down our cheeks, and we stood in the kitchen and held each other. Thank goodness that the kids were in bed asleep. He had taken care of that. After a time, I looked up into his face and I said, "Jim, we need somebody, and we need somebody right now. I'm going to call Tut." Now, Tut was my aunt, my father's youngest sister. She lived out in Virginia. We were so lucky that she and her husband were here. He was a colonel in the Army, and he was stationed at the Pentagon. Just a stroke of luck. I called her. I could hear her telling Dunk, as I told her between sobs, I could hear her telling Dunk what had happened, and finally he said, "Get off the phone and tell her we're coming." Snow or no, because it was still snowing, they came. It took about an hour for them to get there, and after they arrived, we sat in the kitchen. You know, that's where you go to sit when families need to settle something, and talked about what we could do, how we were going to handle this. We were new in town. We didn't live here. Jim was from California. I was from North Carolina. It would have been so much easier if we'd been in North Carolina. We could have just gone to Charlotte. That's where I'm from. Called St. Peter's Catholic Church. The priest would have come. That was my home church. Would have come right away. Looked around and found a spot between some of those old people out in Elmwood Cemetery and moved them over, and we would have had a place for her. Dunk was a different kind of a guy. He was quiet. He was used to making big decisions. He was an Army logistician, and he moved troops. So he didn't say anything for a long time. Now, he had told me one time, "I almost made a mistake once, but I caught it myself." So I knew that if he opened his mouth with something to say, and Jim knew it too, because we perked up, he reached out, touched Jim on the arm and said, "Call tomorrow morning. This is the way to handle it, and exercise your Arlington option." Now, you may not know this, we certainly didn't, that if you're in active duty in the military, you can ask for your grave if you need it, for a spouse or children under 18 years old. Jim did that the next morning. This was 1964. 4 days later, a black car arrived to pick Jim and I up to take us to Arlington National Cemetery to bury our daughter. Now, I ask you, what did I know about Arlington National Cemetery? Nothing. Not a thing. Nothing. Except what most people in the world, or certainly in the United States, had learned on November 25th, 1963. I had watched every moment of the John F. Kennedy funeral on a green Zenith portable television on a rolling cart with little rabbit ears on the top in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I had never seen a city fall to silence like Washington, D.C. fell to silence that day. That you could just hear the shuffling of the feet of all the military soldiers that were marching, and the cloppity-clop-clop of the horses, the 6 horses that were pulling a flat cart that the guy on the TV said was a caisson. It harked back to the Civil War, a flat cart that had taken munitions out to the battlefield and brought the dead back. The flag-draped casket was on the top, and the lonely caparison horse watched behind. The lone horse with the boot turned backwards to signal that the leader had been killed. If you've seen that, maybe you remember it, because the image of seeing that pass over George Washington Bridge is pretty dramatic. Washington Bridge, which connected the Lincoln Memorial with Virginia and Arlington to signal, it was meant to signal that the state had been put back together, that the North and the South had reconciled. That's all I knew. So that morning, Jim and I sat close, holding hands in the back seat of that car, and it took us to the back entrance of the cemetery on Fort Myer to the little red brick chapel at the back gate of Arlington. The hearse was sitting there waiting for us. The door was open. I could see the little white satin casket that I had picked out that had ruffles all around it. I knew that she was in there, and that she was wearing a soft pink corduroy jumper that I had brought, and I knew how soft it was because both Karen and Robin had worn it, and it had been not washed many times. I don't remember much else about that whole thing. We had a mass. The casket sat in the aisle. I sat as close to Jim as I could get, and he sat as close to me as he could get, and probably if we could changed and entered skins, we would have. We went out. The casket was slid into the hearse, and we followed it in that black car. When you go to Arlington to be buried, you don't pick a place. You're assigned to a place. I'd never seen a cemetery with uniform white stones, just what seemed like acres and acres of them. Startling. We didn't have to go very far. It's down a road, then to the left, and then down, and he turned on Roosevelt Drive. The grave was open. They were ready. We walked over. It didn't take very long. And then we left. The hard part came 2 days later when we brought our other 3 children back. They were bewildered. Think of that, 7, 5, 4, wondering what had happened, where had she gone, and trying to explain that feebly to these 3 kids. And Jim and I were standing there. We were doing the best we could. I was crying. He had his arm around me. We were both reaching out to the other kids, and they're just staring at the ground, which was surrounded by snow. There were saplings, just little saplings. They looked like black line drawings in the snow. But there was a marble building up on the hill, and we were standing there, and we heard taps. And Jim touched me on the shoulder, and he said, "Elouise, that's the tomb of the unknowns. There's something going on up there. Let's take the kids up there to see, because it'll be a diversion, something for them to get into." We did that, and that started a ritual in our family. We went often to see Gretchen, Often we took the children with us, sometimes we didn't. But if they were with us, we went to the tomb of the unknown. We saw the changing of the guard. But then we had another little issue to deal with. All of those 4 are born in November. We have the 3rd, the 5th, the 10th, and the 27th covered. And so as you do, we had been accustomed to having individual birthday parties for each of those kids. So what we decided we would continue to have that, but that for Gretchen, whose birthday was November the 10th, we would choose a Sunday in November, and we would have a Sunday birthday. And we would take cake and cookies and flowers and see her, and then we would just walk up the hill to see the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknowns. 47 years we did that. We incorporated the marriages that came in, our daughter-in-law, our son-in-law, our grandchildren, all became part of that. And it continued with no change until 2011. My son Jim, now a colonel in the active Army Reserve himself, called me and he said, "Mom, November the 10th, this year, this is Gretchen's 50th birthday." I said, "That's great. You remembered. That's wonderful. We should have a Sunday birthday. It's her 50th. And you're right. And I asked Jim, and he said, "That's great. We'll do it. We'll meet with flowers, and everybody that's in town, that's in the family will come, and then we'll go out to dinner." And as I was thinking about that, I thought about an essay that Robin wrote. Robin's the younger of the 3. About a time when she was out at Arlington as a youngster, and she was pondering this grave. And Jim came over to her and knelt down beside her, put his arm around her, and said, "You look worried. Are you worried?" And she admitted that she was, and he said, "You don't have to worry about this. You don't." He said, "Because there's only room for 2 more. And like adults sometimes do, he forgot the next sentence. It's only Mom and me." So, for weeks, she says, when she tells the story, she walked around looking at her brother, is it him? Looking at her other sister, is it her? Looking at herself in the mirror and saying, maybe it's me. Until finally she brought it up and she found out that no, it wasn't any of them. It was for me and for him. And this year, in 2011, when we met for our Sunday birthday, we knew who the next one would be because Jim's cancer was active. So we went and we had flowers and we went out to dinner and we took pictures like we always did. And then we came back some months later to bring Jim to his home at 7424 Roosevelt Drive. Jim died in March of 2012, and things have changed at Arlington since 1964. I made the call. I let him know that he was coming and that he wanted an honors ceremony and that I wanted for us to go back to the little chapel at Fort Myer where Gretchen had been buried. I'm one of those people that just likes to keep those things nicely tied up. Well, we knew that we were going to have to wait 5 months to get it. So Jim was cremated, we had a mass, and that created some problems of its own, but they weren't unsolvable when they said, the cremated and everything, and they showed me some commercial urns. I said, not on your life. I don't buy that stuff. So I took a North Carolina ceramic pot out of our living room that had a nice little top I had given it to Jim as a gift 35 years before, and he had liked it, and we had lived with it. So I said, that's it. That will be it. After the Mass, we brought him home until we were going to the burial, August the 1st. The night before the burial, we had the urn. My son, all ever the practical, had said, you can't put a glass pot in the ground, Mother. So I had called a friend, Jack, in Pennsylvania, a master craftsman, and he had made a beautiful box for this urn out of maple for heart and eucalyptus for healing. We put the urn in the box, wrapped in a textile, a yellow textile that I had made and that Jim and I had taken to Italy to be shown in an exhibit. Put notes in and then pegged it. And the next morning, we didn't have any black car. My son had a van. The family all rode out together. And our daughter Karen had her father on his lap. Quite different. When we arrived, it was the same. It was the same chapel, except this time we turned over Jim to the military. And this is what I learned that day when I did that, was that the military knows something that we all have to learn sometime, which is that ceremony and ritual soften sadness somehow, and they add a touch of awe. It was beautiful. Of course, he'd been in the Air Force, so he had all these Air Force guys were his honor guard. The flags were out there. The band was ready. And the chaplain, I love this. We had the Catholic Air Force chaplain, but he wore a white cassock, and it was exactly perfect over his uniform. Floor, shoulder to floor, white. And we followed Jim out, and there was the caisson, the white horses, with the old guard, the 3rd Infantry riders, sitting up so straight, so tall, so perfect. They're the ceremonial guard that take care of all of this stuff. You may wonder, that's a full casket. They have a little drawer. They pull it out, put the urn in. They push the drawer back, tuck the flag up, and you'd never know. We followed. We had the flags, the band, all the marchers, the guys with the rifles. And my hip just said no that day. So I was riding in a car behind the caisson next to the window, my friend Susan driving. And when we turned into Arlington Cemetery, we were following Jim, his caisson, his casket, and I reached down to the floor of the car and I took out my camera and I leaned out the window because I wanted the absolute best pictures that I could get of this whole event. And I knew that this is what Jim would want me to do. He was raised in the 30s in California by a father that was besotted by photography and the movies, and that believed that the only thing that you could do that was the right thing to do was to document every single thing that happened in a family. Now, Jim would have been running along beside this car if he could have been, so I could hear the grandsons and the granddaughters clicking their cameras behind me, but I wanted my own pictures. And if you've seen the card, you've seen it. So I'm taking this picture, and as I pulled back in to the car, I noticed the side view mirror. I thought I could get a little art shot. I can see them behind me in the mirror. And as I looked into the mirror, I saw my grandson, Dan. Dan's easy to spot out in the crowd. 6'1", and he has flaming red hair. And I looked, and I was just flooded with a memory of when he had come from California in March. He favors Jim. He's tall like Jim was. He has the same body type. He's got those same long arms. And when he walked in, I said, come upstairs with me. I've got something I think you're going to want. and I took out Jim's tuxedo. He was a senior in high school. And I gave him everything. I said, try that on. If it fits, it's all yours. And he looked, yes, his eyes got big. He went in the other room, tried it on. It looked like it had been waiting there for him. It fit him perfectly. He took it back to California. He had everything, the studs, the shirts, the cummerbunds, the dancing shoes. He took it back to California and took Jim to 2 proms for the spring. And as I looked in the mirror, head to foot, my eyes just filled with tears. He was wearing Jim's dancing shoes. Yeah. It didn't take us long to get to the grave site, and that doesn't take very long. It's 20 minutes. You get out, they take you over, the stand is waiting, the honor guard forms, they flop out that flag and hold it taut over the urn like a canopy. There's a song. The priest said a few words, looked at me and said, I'm not going to bless this grave today. It was blessed in 1964. And I said, thank you. And then, nearing the end, the riflemen filed over off to the side. They stood there to shoot the 3 volleys. People will say that that's a 21-gun salute. It's not. It's 3 links, 7 men shoot 3 times, and that's 3 volleys. And it connects to history, to the days where when battles were being fought and battlegrounds were being littered with the dead, they would stop the battle to clear away the dead and the wounded. And when they were through, they would shoot 3 volleys as the signal that the dead had been taken care of. And that became incorporated into the honors funeral. They shoot 3 volleys and then taps. The bugler steps back and the notes just rise up, and it's as though they're hanging in the trees. And those trees are the saplings that were there 47 years before, that are now majestic oaks sheltering the wide space around this grave. They began to leave, just marching away. They were done. They were finished. They folded the flag into a precise triangle. The master sergeant stood up straight and tall, walked over and knelt down on one knee in front of me, his white gloved hands handing me this tight triangle with the white stars on the top, and looked me straight in the eyes with such a kind eyes. On behalf of the President of the United States, we thank you for his service. This is the moment that every military family shares with every other when a military member is buried with honors. And then they left. They were done. Well, where are you going? I'm not done. I mean, what are you thinking? But we went to have something to eat, and 2 days later, I came back. And my relationship with Arlington National Cemetery had changed, and I didn't know it or understand it that day, that I took a little folding camp stool out of my car and dragged it 20 feet to the 4th tombstone in that row, 7424 Roosevelt Drive, and sat down. Do you know, the first thing I felt was strange, and I didn't expect it. I was awkward and uncertain, almost embarrassed to be there in the sea of white stones, because what do when you go to sit beside a grave of someone you've loved more than half of your life? Well, I'll tell you one thing. If you ever have to do that, take Kleenex. Crying is a given. You're going to do it. Crying is a given. And you won't find a workbook anywhere that tells you how to do this. You got to figure it out all on your own. So I sat there and I thought, well, I have an iPod. I could listen to music. I'm a journaler. I could sit here and write. I got an iPad back in the car. Maybe if I brought that over and I thought of something brilliant, I could just write it down and send it out. And I have my camera. Always my camera. And then behind me, I heard this clanking in the voice in the distance, and I turned around and looked, and this was August, there were 3 cars hooked together for like a tour mobile with tourists hanging out both sides with their cameras up, click, 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 click. And I thought, oh my God, I'm part of the landscape. What am I going to do? So that was the first day. And then I kept coming back a couple of times a week if I wanted to, and then I settled in on Wednesdays. Always taking pictures, always looking, always realizing. Like Robin, I was sitting there looking and thinking, but not like Robin, I had more certainty. I knew who was going to be the next one in here. This was my grave, too. And I looked around at this sea, and I realized there were 4,000 tombstones in 35, and I only knew 2 people. Only 2. This would not do. This was not going to do for me. Because what if it really was going to be like the 3rd act of Our Town and we could sit around and chat? I would have nobody to chat with. I would know no one. This was not going to work. So I looked and, well, there was Captain Smither. He had been there since the same week that Gretchen was buried. There was Lieutenant Colonel Connolly on either side of us. Yeah, they had been there. And Jim and I would say to each other, we've got to find out who they are. We're going to be with them forever. But life was full. We were busy. We had kids. We had jobs. We had important things we were doing. So we never got around to it. Well, I needed to know who they were. And I found out. From the Army's Foundation of History, Historical Foundation. I called him up and they looked him up. Smither was very interesting. He had led a whole group of engineers during World War II to every battle in Europe. And they rebuilt roads and repaired bridges so that the troops could move. Connolly, now Jim was going to have a great time with him. I knew it because he was Air Force. And he had started out as a young man in World War I in the United States Air Service, which was the first ever air anything that the United States military had. And he'd gone through all 4 permutations of that, ended up in the Air Force. They both had Bronze Stars. They were good men. Good men that had been there with our daughter all of that time. I have many more to check on, but I just found one this week. I went up to the Tomb of the Unknown and I met a young sentinel. And he wasn't walking, doing his thing, he was just helping. And so he had time to talk to me. And when he heard that Jim was buried in 35, he told me to go down and see William Daniel's grave. William Daniel was a sentinel in 56 to 59, and he designed the badge that the sentinels wear. He was a master sergeant. And he said, we think so highly of him. Check him out, find out where he is. He showed me his picture. I had another neighbor that I had found. I had been back to the changing of the guard so many times, and if we had only known that day we were there with the kids, that whole change is based on 21. It's choreographed on the number 21. They march 21 steps to the end of the mat. Wait 21 seconds. Turn 21 seconds. Turn. 21 steps back. It's a dance. And not long ago, I went and checked it, and it was absolutely on the money. I wish we could have told the kids that so long ago. I was now coming on a Wednesday, not a Sunday. I took out my camera. The flag is at half-mast. What is the matter? Well, I'd never realized that on Sunday it was flying at full mast because there were no funerals. Here, every time on a weekday that they're having burials, the flag is raised to half-staff 30 minutes before the first burial and not raised back till 30 minutes after the last burial. It's all about honor and making sure that everybody receives full honor. I realized sitting there, 25 to 30 burials a day on the weekdays. How was it that we had felt so private when Jim was buried? Because they plan it that way, so that the family's protected. They had 660 acres to work with, and they schedule it. And I came flat up against that myself a few weeks later when I was entering up to see Jim, and I got stopped. And up ahead, I saw a mass of people. It was still summer uniforms. It was Navy. They were all in white, and there was a big crowd, and there was a flag with silver stars on it. I thought, my gosh, that's an admiral. Wonder who he is. I hadn't seen anything in the past. And then this guard came toward me, driving a golf cart. Now, really, I thought, that guy, if he's driving a golf cart, has got to know something or somebody. So I flagged him down and asked him what was happening. Oh, it's a biggie. He took out his clipboard and he started to tell me, but right then, low and loud slap right over us, 5 Navy jets, and one peeled straight up for the missing man formation. He said, I thought that was a big wig. And he looked at the paper. I said, how long have you worked out here? Oh, ma'am, I started working out here when I was right out of high school. I left for 2 years, but I came back because I missed it so much, and I'm going to be 50 years old this year. You must like it. No, I don't like it. I love it here. I love it. This is the most hallowed ground in our country, Arlington National Cemetery. I'm proud to be here. And I had other people telling me that, others. But I was still looking for some more evidence that I was going to be all right there when I came. And nobody comes up to 35. I mean, they've been dead so long that there's nobody to bring them flowers. And so I wasn't meeting anybody and getting any kind of personal relationship. So I went down and found Section 60. Section 60 is where the recent casualties from Afghanistan and Iraq are buried. If you go into Arlington Cemetery and walk down Eisenhower, you will eventually get to it. And in Section 60 on the weekend are families. There are families there. There are children. Young families are there. And I got out and I walked around down there. And I was amazed at the level of creativity, that the things that people leave to mark the connection between them and the person that's buried in that grave. Pictures, little photographs, glass bits, rocks. You saw probably the little angel, the ceramic heart, the hand-carved wooden bracelet. The one I saw recently, I stood there and I looked at it, and there were 6 beer bottle caps on the top of the tomb. It makes a nice little shelf, that tomb. And there's 6, and at the bottom were 7 bottles of beer. 6 open and empty, and 1 capped and ready. And I thought, oh to have been here to seen those buddies when they came. Well, I liked that, leaving things so much, and it does come from the Jewish tradition, but I decided I'll borrow that. It's sweet and it's comforting to leave something behind. So I started taking special pebbles and rocks and arranging them. It's not enough for me just to put them. I have to fiddle with things. And so I arranged them in special ways on the top of Jim's tombstone. And we'd always brought things back from trips and whatever. And then I realized in February he was going to get a new tombstone. Our 47-year-old tombstone with Gretchen's name on the front was going to be whipped away. And it would be replaced by a brand shiny new white marble tombstone with Jim on the front and Gretchen on the back. She'd always been on the front. And one day I rode up and I saw it as I turned the corner. There was number 4 from the end, and it was shining in the sun, and it was clean, and it was white, and I thought they'd changed it. I stopped and I got out and I thought, wondered what they did with my rocks. What could they have done with my rocks? And I raced over to see. And on the top shelf of Jim's tombstone were all of my rocks. But it wasn't just that they were all there. They were on the new stone exactly as I had left them on the old stone. And at that moment, I decided, with that much care for the family, that I thought, I'll be safe here. It's okay. Now, I go down to section 60, and I stop and I talk to people, and what I find, and I'm going to share some of these quickly with you, this story changes right under my feet. I stopped one day because there was a big banner, yellow banner, and I couldn't tell what it was, and it was on stakes in a big spot, and there was a man standing by the curb, and I said, could you tell me, what is that? What is that yellow banner? And he said, that's 101st Airborne, lady. That's the Screaming Eagles. They come and they put it up because they're buddies, and there's a whole group of them buried over there, and they want them to know that they're there when they're there. And he said, see how it's flipping in the wind? The wind's catching up. They're going to have to take it down soon. I said, well, I've just been here visiting my husband, and I saw it, and I'd never seen it before. And I said, are you here visiting somebody? Yeah, my son. It's right over there. These are our chairs. There's a red stadium chair and a blue stadium chair. He said, my wife and I bring these chairs. We drive 8 hours on every holiday weekend to come and have a really good visit with our son. He was just 21, but you know, when he was 15 years old, he decided he was going to be a Marine. He had options when he graduated from high school. He had good grades, he played basketball, he got scholarship offers. Didn't matter to him, he had decided, and he joined the Corps. When he was deployed to Afghanistan 2 years ago, he sent his mother and me an email before he left and said, if anything happens to me, remember this. I am doing what I wanted to do. We try to take comfort in that. We'd have liked to have him near us, but we're glad we chose to bring him here. It's the right place. It's a good place. It's the right place for him. I was told about a young woman who was not too far from him, maybe 2 lines over, or further over into the block. Jessica is her name. Jessica was twice in Iraq, deployed to Iraq. She was with the 101st Airborne. She was a medic. She had just graduated from a 2-year college with an art degree when she entered the service. And she always liked to help people, so she decided to be a medic. On her second deployment, she was sitting in a truck while her buddies, the people that she was looking after, that she would be if she were needed, were taking mines out of a road near Baghdad. And one of those things blew up, hit the truck, and killed Jessica. She was awarded a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, Commendation Medal. She was 25. And then I met someone that knew her father. And they said, you know, Ellouise, he does the same thing that you do. He comes from the West, and he comes and he brings a chair, and he sits out here, and he talks to the families, because he says he wants to know who the neighbors are. He wants to know who's out here with his daughter. Now, I had a thing happen 2 days ago that I'm going to add to the story for you today because I'm so touched by it. In that same section, you'll often see large markers that are reinterments, that they're soldiers that were lost in a long ago battle where remains have been found and they've been identified and they've been brought to Arlington and buried. You don't know the story or whatever, but someone put me in touch on Facebook with a man who's career Army on active duty right now, who spent 3 years on the Honor Guard detail at Arlington. And we've been corresponding. And he told me the most beautiful thing, I think. He said that he often was in the Honor Guard for the reinterments, and that one that he remembered that he was so touched by, and he said, I'm not going to tell you that I remember his name. But before we did the placement, there was no family. This was a World War II vet being returned. And before we did the burial, our platoon leader read us his service record so that we would know who we had here. And he had served in Europe, and then he was in a prison camp, and then he was lost. And he said, I'll never forget that, because across several generations that morning, me and my buddies stood together in brotherhood to see this guy into his final resting place. That sort of fits another piece in there altogether, I think. I've often wondered when I see the old guard riding those horses, pulling those caissons, it's so close to their work. They're not cowboys that just ran in. They're soldiers that could be deployed tomorrow or that were yesterday and now on this duty for a while. It's very close to their own life. And now we have some kind of information about it. But I'll close with this little bit because I love it. 3 days before Memorial Day, I was out there, gone to visit Jim, and I was going to tell this story at the Women's Memorial. So I went out, and as I was driving up toward the tomb and toward Jim, I couldn't believe it. I was just meeting a herd of 12-year-olds. Now, in the spring, you may not know this, but field trips from all over this country come to Arlington, and that place is filled with young people. And many, many middle schoolers come because it's the civics lesson, it's the American history lesson year. And here they came, a mob scene. I pulled over and stopped. There was no way I was going to meet that head on. And the teacher passed right by my car. They were so happy. It was hot, they had on shorts, they were laughing. It was just beautiful. And so she came by and I said, field trip, right? And she said, New Jersey. We're down from New Jersey. We've just been up to the tomb. They loved it. They had such a wonderful time up there, but now we're on personal business. personal business. She said, you see my colleague back there carrying a huge white wreath. We're on our way to Section 60. One of our alums from our middle school was killed in Afghanistan several years ago. These students never knew him. I did, because I taught him when he was a middle school student. And we're taking that wreath to him. And they sailed on off. That river of 12-year-oldness just went right on down the road. Now, I had my visit with Jim, and on the way out, I went down there, parked, and I got out. I could see that wreath up on a lightweight florist stand in the middle of the section. And as I walked over to it, I could smell the perfume of the smelly lilies that was being pumped up by the heat and the breeze. And when I got there, it was big greens with white lilies and white roses, white chrysanthemums, daisies too. Right there, yep, 25 years old, 2 years ago. I don't know what you're thinking, but I was thinking, no, they didn't know him, but they will never forget him. How could you? They will never forget him. And it reminded me of an African folk tale. The wisdom that we get from these folk tales, and the line of wisdom after the story is, no one is truly dead as long as they are remembered. And that's what I've come to see in Arlington National Cemetery. It's a place of honor and a place of remembrance. Thank you for coming.